So anyway, this kind of this idea kind of started with, of course, COVID-19 and all that stuff. And a lady I've been working with out of Lake Oswego, Portland, in Oregon, I mean, near Portland. She has a website, Bakerpedia, it's for commercial bakers and such. And we've been working on some stuff together. And so she had this idea last week. She had a baking party online, so we did that. It was fun, just sort of showing some simple ideas. So I thought, okay, I'll try it tonight, see where it goes, and maybe now Kathy wants me to do another one and do macaron, so maybe I'll do that on Saturday or something. And so I thought I'd try ciabatta bread, because that was something, Kimberly, I was going to do with the vets as a quick sort of simple way to do a nice bun. It's the preparation time ahead, it takes a lot of time. It's about a 7-hour process, right? So the first one I'm going to go on, so these are the buns here. If you can, no, you can't really see them that well. Let me turn the camera, there you go, on the corner of the bench. These are the buns that we're making. And ciabatta is an Italian bun, which means slipper bread, because they're nice and light, and they're very open, the grain inside. And they're really nice and soft and moist inside. So they're like a nice, soft, comfortable slipper is kind of the idea, right? So that's what we're kind of trying to put together here. So the ingredients, I've been asked a little bit about ingredients. The ingredients I'm using Robin Hood, Best for Bread. So any kind of Best for Bread flour that is a little bit higher in gluten protein is good. This one happens to be 13% protein. So I don't need to add any vital wheat gluten. But if you only have all-purpose, which tends to be around 10%, you can add wheat gluten. So you just make up some of the difference with wheat gluten. And I just use the Bob's Red Mill that you can get in the grocery store. I use Fleischmann's instant dry yeast, or any other brand, LaSaff, and that is fine too. It comes in a vacuum packed brick. And once you open it, you need to keep it stored airtight. Otherwise, it'll only last for about a week. So the key is keeping it airtight, and then it'll last you a couple of months. Otherwise, the moisture gets out the yeast and it starts to die. And so I use this little Rubbermaid container to keep that. I'm also using malt today. Malt is optional, it's not a must, but it helps the fermentation. It's diastatic malt. I've seen videos on YouTube too where people buy the barley and malt it, like they sprout it themselves and toast it and grind it all up and everything. Basically, it's a little bit of his flavor, but the other part of it is there's a lot of enzyme activity in the malt flour, and it breaks down the starch into fermentable sugars. So you get better rate or better speed of fermentation. Because instant yeast is a little bit slow getting going. It's not as quick as what commercial bakers would use would be like a brew yeast or a fresh yeast. So that's kind of the ingredients there. Any questions so far? Yeah? Yeah, those are fine. Yep. Yep. Yeah. That is not instant yeast, that is active yeast. So when you buy dry yeast, there's two types. And so when you see it in the grocery store, what you want to look for is whether it's instant or active. Right? The active yeast is, you could actually visually see the difference if you were to pour them on the table. Active yeast is a little bit larger pearl. Often it's a little bit darker in color, and it's essentially a different type of bacterium that is coated in a starch coating. So the reason you have to dissolve it in water with a little bit of sugar is that you have to dissolve that starch coating and activate it. So the fact that it's called active yeast is because it's active inside that starch cell, but you have to let it loose. Instant yeast, you don't have to do that. You just mix it with the dry and throw it into the dough, as you'll see what we're going to do here in a moment. And instant yeast is for ease of use, and once it's hydrated and gets going, rate of fermentation, it's generally preferred. The advantage to active yeast is that storage can be longer. If you were to buy a jar of active yeast, you could probably keep it 6 months at home, no problem. Because that starch coating is protecting the yeast from any activity that is unwanted. Whereas with the instant yeast, you have to keep it sealed nice and tight, otherwise it will start to die on you. And you can always put it in some water and sugar and see if it bubbles to check if there's anything wrong with it. If it doesn't bubble, it's dead, and then you would want to throw it out and get fresh yeast. Does that answer what you were looking for? Perfect. Excellent. Also on malt, what might be easier to find is malt syrup. You can usually find malt flour or malt syrup in a health food store. The syrup, you just have to keep in mind about 30 to 40% of it is water. So you might use a touch more, right? But you know, it's minor. Like I said, it's a very small amount. In this recipe, we're only using 2 grams of malt flour. But it has enough effect, right? So, sorry, I was admitting someone in from the waiting room there. Right? Okay, so I'm just going to set these buns out of the way for now. Over here on the stove. Okay, so this particular bread is we're using what is called pre-ferment. There are in baking, there's a variety of different pre-ferments that are used. There's pâte fermentée, sponge, biga, and poulish. Those are the 4 general pre-ferments. Right? Poulish is often used for more, well, sourdough is also a pre-ferment as well. But sourdough usually takes about 3 days to establish. So you're basically building up natural fermentation to get the lactic acid and those sour notes and everything. Poulish is a little bit more acidic. It's often what is used for baguettes and French type breads, and it is a very watery pre-ferment. It's usually roughly equal parts water and flour. Right? And so the more liquid your pre-ferment, the more acid you will develop. The stiffer your pre-ferment, the more fermented notes you will get and the less acidity. And a biga is the stiffest of the pre-ferments. A sponge is what's used in commercial white bread baking, and sponges can be varying different amounts of water. They'll often contain yeast food, some salt to regulate fermentation, and they can be anywhere from 4 to 12 hours depending on the production system. Some of them are even shorter, some of them are only like an hour to 2 hours. Right? And a biga, we're doing a 4-hour biga today. But bigas can also be 8 or 12 hours, right? Like the biga that I make up today, that I'm not going to stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning to finish baking all the bread. I'm just going to put it in the fridge and retard it, so that retarding slows down the yeast fermentation, and I can use it tomorrow to make more buns and things like that with it. So to start off, for the biga, we have flour and yeast. I don't know if you could see the little bit of gray in there. That's the instant yeast, and so I'm just going to stir that together. And I'm using a plastic bowl so you can just see how I'm mixing it so that it's clear. And I have my water measured out here. So I'm using a wooden spoon, but I'm using the handle of the spoon to mix. Okay, and so you just pour the water in and just start stirring it with the wooden spoon. And keep going around in a circle, and you see how it all starts to come together. Room temperature is fine. You don't want it too warm. So usually 68 to 75 in that range, but usually room temperature, which is about 70, 72, that will be fine. Maybe in a few... Some do, but it's that's a little on the warm side. The yeast will die at 140. And your rate of fermentation slows down once you get over about 95 degrees. So it doesn't improve fermentation, it actually slows it. And so that's all we want to do is just combine it so that it all comes together. So that it all comes together in a ball like that, okay? And just in case it's going to fill the container because this now has to rise for 4 hours. Either at room temperature or slightly warmer. I have a little, I'm in a condo that I'm renting out here in Quebec, and we have a little closet here where the hot water heater is, and it's nice and warm in there. So, and there's a step stool, so I use that as my fermentation box, right? So it's about 85 degrees, it's perfect, right? So I just spray a little bit of the pan release spray on the lid, and just close that up. And now that would go in the fermentation box, or in our case, I'm going to be putting it in the fridge later on. And so it doesn't have to at this point, because it will help you release it a little bit. You can, because it won't absorb it. It's just there to help release the dough. And so, yes, ma'am. It's around 85 degrees. Yeah, more or less, yeah. I mean, today I had so many, because I was prepping everything for tonight. We have a little electric heater in case it gets really cold, and there's radiant heat in this place, and sometimes the pipes get clogged. Long story short, but so I turned on the electric heater in there, so it was probably about 90 today, just to make sure I got it going really good. So it's not about time, it's more about fermentation. So it's not that it has to be, especially when you're doing this at home, it doesn't have to be precisely 4 hours. You want to see that it doubles in bulk at least, right? You can also leave it overnight, that's perfectly fine. Especially at room temperature, we turn the heat down at night, so it drops to about 65, 68. So it's not quite retarding, but it slows it down just a little bit, and that works really well as well. And it's the fermentation process at this step is a few things. First of all, it is producing the nice fermented yeasty aromas, right? And it also gets more enzyme activity. Some of it is the amylase enzyme from the flour to help break down sugars. So what we call reducing sugars that makes them fermentable by the yeast. And there's also then some activity from protease enzymes, which help make the gluten more extensible, right? So that it's less bucky and not as rubbery, right? So that is all what's happening in that 4-hour process, right? And so after 4 hours, it grows in bulk, and so this is another bowl, and so you can see it's quite a bit larger, and I didn't spray my plastic well enough, so there it is. So it's mostly coming off. And so you can see some of the big gassy holes there, right? Where that it has risen up nicely. So this was made about 4 hours ago, right? And so now I'll show you the next step is then after that. And so now I'll show you the next step is then after that 4-hour period is we're going to start making the dough. So I have my water measured up, and again the water is just room temperature, and I have flour, salt, and more yeast. And what did I do with my book? Yes, there's only 1 gram of yeast in the pre-ferment, so there's less than 1/8 of a teaspoon in the pre-ferment. So it's just to help get it going. If you did no yeast at all and left it for like 18 hours or so, you would still get some fermentation because there's yeast naturally occurring in the flour. And there's just yeast bacteria in the air and everything too, which is kind of how a sour is often made. So I'm just going to stir up I have the malt powder in here. See if I don't know if you can see that, but the malt powder is in the middle. And then the yeast is up there, and you can see the bright white is the salt down on the bottom. Oh, what you got there? Okay. Uh-huh. Cool. So I'll mix that up. And so for mixing the water and the flour into this, this is going to be a very soft liquid dough. This is what we call a high hydration dough. This is 90% hydration. So baker's percent isn't really actually percentages like formulas. It's like Jesse and Chelsea are probably, their head exploding right now. Can you make 190%? But it's a ratio. It's basically for every 100 pounds of flour, we're using 90 pounds of water. That's what the ratios are, right? Because this dough is also quite stiff, if we put all the water in at once, it's just going to be lumps everywhere. So we have to kind of gradually work it in. So I start off with roughly, I eyeball it with about half the water. And I like to use a glove, just makes it easier for the cleanup and things afterwards. And you want to kind of squish it, okay? So I'll come a little bit closer so you can see how because it's good exercise for your forearm, right? And you just want to keep squishing it. And you won't get it all mixed in, but you're going to break up that pre-ferment, the big guy, into lots of little pieces. I'm just going to do this all by hand so that people could make this if they don't have a mixer. That's just bigger and half the water. Yeah. And now I'll sprinkle in about half of the dry and combine that together, and then do the same squishing and going around the bowl and gathering it together. I hope you can see that fairly well. You can. It sticks a lot. I'll show you tricks for that yet too in a moment. But also the thing is that I do so much of of baking and things like that you start to get chapped hands, especially in the winter, from all the water all the time. It dries the skin out, right? So I added some of the dry and worked that in, and now I'm going to add the rest of the water and work that in as well. Again, yes ma'am. Yep, it looks like a sloppy mess. There we go. So let me see if I'm going to try and tilt the camera down just a little bit more. Yeah, but because I originally had it set up in landscape mode and didn't know Zoom won't do that, there we go, that's a little better maybe. Yeah. And I was going to try and do follow me with the gimbal, but then you can't switch back and forth. Like you can't load follow me on the gimbal and then switch over to Zoom because the camera, the gimbal disconnects from the phone essentially. The follow me is when you focus it on, that's kind of partly why I'm wearing the darker cap today, is that, and then the camera would follow me as I'm moving. like the gimbal would move for me. So you can see I'm smushed that all up, and it's just all lumpy, right? Okay, and I'm going to add the rest of the dry. So with COVID-19 and other things that have been going on in January and February, and all the snow we've had here, I really haven't been to the gym much either, so this ends up being kind of my exercise too. Yeah, so I have to work that off as well. And so again, I've squished it, okay? And so it's a little bit rough still. And I don't know if you can see that. All right. And so now I'm going to take my hand, I'm going to kind of cup my hand, just like this, and hold the bowl on the table, and I'm kind of going to slap it, okay? And so this is kind of like a mixing process with a soft dough like this that helps develop the gluten a little bit, and it just gets everything blended up. So I'm just doing this. I'm just scooching it and slapping it, but keeping my hand cupped the whole time. And so you just need to do that for a minute or two, or until you run out of breath. Not very long. That was what, maybe 40 seconds? And so now, Stefan, going back to cleaning your hands off. So because this is a very wet, sticky dough, you can see it's thicker than pancake batter, but it's quite wet and sticky. So one of the difference with wet doughs is you don't want to use flour for release. You use water. And so I'm going to wet my other hand, and that way I can just clean most of it off of the glove, like so. Now I can get the glove off, grab my trusty scraper, and scrape the sides of the bowl down. And now it is ready for the first hour of fermentation. And I say the first hour of fermentation because we go through 3 hours in total. And it gets, there's what I call two folds. Right? So this is now the dough is made. So this dough gets covered with plastic and goes into our fermenting room or set it aside in a warm area. Some of the new ovens today actually have proofing settings on the oven that you can set. The older ovens, most of them, especially the electric ones, you can't set them any lower than 170, and that is just much too hot for the dough. But if you have a cabinet that you can set to 100 degrees or 95, that would be ideal. And so I'm just going to I think there's a setting on it, because we bought one at ADM, and like a double oven, and it seems to be more common on the ones that have a small oven chamber at top and a big oven chamber in the bottom, so that you can proof the dough in the top and then move it to the bottom and bake it. So then after an hour of fermentation, you can see the dough has risen, and usually I forgot to spray the plastic on that one. You want to spray the plastic before you put it on, or spray the dough with some oil. And so here we have the dough. You can see it's risen quite a bit. It's getting all nice and bubbly. Right? And so now what we're going to do is stretch it and fold it. Now this works better if you have a bigger bin. These are the bowls that I have available, so it works okay for me. But if you had like a big plastic square bin like this size or something like that, then it's just easier to spread it out and to lift it and fold it, right? So all we want to do is have some water handy or the sink running, wet your hands, and then you reach in and pick it up and stretch it, fold it over. Turn the bowl around, do it again, pick it up and fold it over, turn it sideways, or like, 3 o'clock, up and over, and then 9 o'clock, and up and over, and then just go around a couple more times to make sure it's all nicely folded. So what we're doing here is gently degassing it. That is getting all the CO2 out so we can get fresh oxygen in. And we're helping to develop the gluten some more by some of this stretching. And this will then get covered and it ferments for an hour, and you do it once more. And then you let it rise for another hour. And then we are ready to start putting them onto the baking pan. So after it is risen, so now we've got it ready. It's had all of its rest, and you can see it's kind of like a jiggly pudding, all nice and bubbly. Right? And I have a baking pan here, and I like to use on the bottom for these types of crusty breads, I like to use what is in the baking industry, it's called farina. In Canada, it's usually called wheatlets, or some people call it wheat hearts. It's kind of similar to semolina, but semolina is made from durum, which is a very, very hard wheat. But the thing about wheatlets is they're nice and fine. Cornmeal is okay as well, but cornmeal tends to be very coarse and kind of too hard and almost too crunchy on the teeth, right? And wheatlets is quite easy to buy in the store because in retail it's sold as cream of wheat, because that's all it is. It's wheat. So I put my cream of wheat in a Ziploc bag, so it's easier to get my dainty little paws in there, right? And so I take a bunch of the wheatlets and I sprinkle them onto the bottom of the pan. Just a nice. No, there's a silicone mat on it. You can, if you don't have silicone or parchment, you can grease it a little bit to make sure it doesn't stick. Like pan spray it, and then put your semolina on there and that. Right? Yes, the silpat is what works great. Right? It takes a couple minutes longer to bake with the silpat because of the heat resistance it provides, but it's excellent release and everything. Right? So now we take our fermented dough, and you want to pour it out onto the pan so that it's about in the middle of the pan. So now you can see we have this blob on the pan, okay? And so now I'm going to quite liberally sprinkle it, dust it with some flour, just regular all-purpose or bread flour is fine. And we're just going to carefully stretch this over the rest of the pan. And I'm going to make buns with this, but if you want to make loaves, you can make 2 loaves or 4 smaller loaves. And we just do that simply by cutting the dough, by separating it. So I'm going to cut it once down the middle here. And once more here. And once more here. Now in this process we end up knocking some of the gas out, so especially on the ones on the ends. So we leave it sit for another 30 minutes as the final proof before it goes in the oven. And you want to preheat your oven to 500 degrees. And I'm going to turn my oven on now. My oven takes about 15 minutes to get hot. And you also want to put a steam pan on the bottom rack. So I recommend either like an 8x8 aluminum foil pan that you don't need, or an old, I use an old 9x13 pan here that's here. So I use this as my steam pan, right? And I just put that in the bottom rack of the oven. And I let that get hot with the oven as you heat up. And when the 500. And it's a good idea to, if you don't know for sure the performance of your oven, which is perhaps one of my habits from my technical support days and working in labs and everything like that. I'm always checking. And so when we moved to this cottage, I of course had to get my oven thermometer out and put it in and check. And sure enough, the oven's off by 15 degrees. So you want to make sure that it is heating properly for you. At 500, it may not make as big a difference, but when you're trying to bake at 350 and it's actually only like 335, it makes a big difference. Yep. 8. I got 8 buns out of this. So this is about 800 grams of dough. So it'll make 2, you could simply cut it either down the length or down the middle if you just wanted to make a loaf with it. And then bake the whole loaf. When you bake the loaves, they bake a little bit longer. The buns take about 18 minutes to bake. So we preheat the oven to 500, and we have the steam pan in there. And then when the oven is hot, we pour a cup of water into the steam pan, okay? And that is to generate steam in the oven. And so that there's lots of steam in the oven when you put the buns or the bread in. And I don't have a spray bottle, so I use this little condiment bottle filled with water, and I squirt water on both sides of the oven. And you do that every 30 seconds, 3 times in the beginning as you're baking. And after about 10 minutes, after about 5 minutes, you turn the oven down to 450. And then you let it continue baking the remaining 13 minutes. So the initial 500 degrees is to get what we call oven spring, to get the lift and to allow the steam to develop. And the steam will drop the temperature a little bit as well. The steam is there to pre-gelatinize the surface starch on the crust of the buns. So it allows them to expand a little bit more. And that's what gives you that really nice, thin, crisp crust. So if you notice when there's crusty breads where it's basically just been baked really long and it's a thick, hard crust, that's not been steam baked. But when you steam bake, you get a nice thin crust and it's nice and crispy, right? And these will go soft in a plastic bag, but you stick them in a toaster oven or in a hot oven for a minute or 2, and the crust comes right back, right? And they're beautiful. All right, well, have a good evening or a good afternoon wherever you are, and I will post on Facebook when I do another one, hopefully this Saturday. All right, bye. Thank you. Bitte sehr, merci. Au revoir.